At the far eastern tip of Bermuda, where St. George's Island narrows to a wooded strip of land between two harbors, there is a mansion that nobody lives in. It sits on a hill above Castle Harbor, surrounded by 22 acres of overgrown estate, looking out across water so blue it hurts. The windows are dark, the gardens have been swallowed, the swimming pool is empty, and somewhere in the undergrowth, buried under decades of brush and salt air, there are the remains of a railway, narrow gauge, 18 inches between the rails. A miniature locomotive, built as a scaled-down replica of a Baltimore and Ohio Railroad engine, once carried guests along a track that wound through the property, over a hill, through a tunnel beneath Ferry Road, and down to a private junction where the Aster family's personal rail line connected to the Bermuda Railway's main route. The last time that train ran was 1971. The mansion has been empty for longer than that. The estate has changed hands, been divided, been forgotten. The ruins of the engine shed still stand. The remnants of the turntable are still in the ground, and the best view of Castle Harbor on the entire island belongs to a house that the most famous fortune in American history built and then walked away from. Nobody tells this story. Not the Bermuda Tourism Board. Not the history books that catalog the Aster Empire. Not the documentaries that trace the family from John Jacob Astor's fur trade fortune through the Gilded Age mansions of Manhattan to the sinking of the Titanic. This estate, this abandoned paradise, sits in a footnote of a footnote, visited only by hikers who stumble onto the Bermuda Railway Trail and find, at the end of a wooded path, the remains of something that shouldn't be there. The deeper I went into why it was built and why it was abandoned, the more I found a story that connects the Titanic, the Second World War, the decline of an empire, and the quiet, permanent erasure of a world that the Astors built on the edge of the Atlantic and then surrendered without a fight. Start with how it got there, because the origin of the estate begins with a drowning. On April 15, 1912, John Jacob Astor IV, the richest man aboard the Titanic, went down with the ship. He was 47 years old. His body was recovered from the Atlantic, covered in soot. His watch stopped at the moment of his death. He left behind a fortune estimated at over $150 million, equivalent to several billion in today's currency. He left behind the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, vast tracts of Manhattan real estate, and an estate in Rhinebeck, New York, called Ferncliff, where Stanford White had designed one of the first indoor swimming pools in the country. He also left behind a 20-year-old son named Vincent. Vincent Aster inherited everything. At 20, he became one of the richest men in the world. He dropped out of Harvard. He took control of the family's properties. He managed the real estate empire. He served in the Navy during the First World War. And by the early 1930s, exhausted by New York winters and the social machinery of being an Aster in Manhattan, he went looking for somewhere to disappear. He found Bermuda. Bermuda in the 1930s was what the Hamptons would become half a century later, a discreet retreat for American wealth, accessible by steamship from New York, warm enough in winter to make the crossing worthwhile, and sufficiently British in its governance to provide the kind of social privacy that American society could not. The island had no automobiles until 1946, no cars. The only mechanized transport was the Bermuda Railway, a single-track line that ran from one end of the island to the other, rattling through limestone cuts and across wooden trestles with a rhythm so erratic that locals called it the rattle and shake. Vincent bought 22 acres at Ferry Reach, the narrow, isolated strip at Bermuda's far eastern end, between St. George's Harbor and Castle Harbor. The land was surrounded by water on three sides. It was remote even by Bermuda's standards. The nearest town was Old St. George's, the original colonial capital, a place that had been quiet since Hamilton replaced it in 1815. Ferry Reach was the end of the line in every sense, and that was precisely what Vincent wanted. He built a mansion. He built guest cottages. He built a boathouse on Castle Harbor. He built a swimming pool. He landscaped 22 acres of subtropical gardens, planting on a hill that gave every window in the main house a view of the harbor that visitors described as the finest on the island. He hosted Hollywood royalty. Shirley Temple stayed. The estate became, for the brief years of the late 1930s, a pocket of interwar glamour on the edge of the Atlantic, a world away from Manhattan, a world away from everything. And then he built the railway. This is the detail that stopped me, because the railway is where the story shifts from wealth to something else. Vincent Astor was chairman of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, one of the oldest and most storied rail companies in America. He didn't just invest in trains, he ran them. And at Ferry Reach, he built a private narrow-gauge line, roughly 1,400 feet of track, with a miniature locomotive that was a custom-built replica of a B&O 262 mainliner, scaled down to run on 18-inch gauge track. The train had 2 passenger cars, each seating 4 guests, and 2 luggage cars. It ran from a boat jetty on the waterfront, up through the estate, over the hill, through a tunnel carved beneath Ferry Road, and down to a private junction where Astor's track met the Bermuda Railway main line. The junction was called Astor's Halt. It appeared on the Bermuda Railway's schedule. It was a real station, on a real railway, built for one family. Astor's guests could arrive by steamship from New York, board the Bermuda Railway at Hamilton, ride to Astor's Halt, step off the public train and directly onto Vincent's private miniature railway, and be carried through his estate to the front door of his mansion without ever touching a public road. A private railway, on a private estate, on the far end of a British island in the Atlantic, built by the son of the man who went down on the Titanic, operated by a scaled-down replica of the locomotive his own company manufactured, connected to the public rail network at a junction that bore his name, as if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Now here's what killed it, because what killed it came from the sky. In 1940, Britain was at war. The Atlantic was full of German submarines. The United States was not yet officially in the conflict, but President Roosevelt, who was a personal friend of Vincent Astor and had used the Aster yacht Nourmahal for fishing trips and intelligence-gathering expeditions, was preparing for the possibility. In September 1940, the Destroyers for Bases Agreement was signed. The United States provided 50 aging destroyers to Britain. In exchange, Britain granted the U.S. 99-year leases on military bases in several British territories. Bermuda was one of them. The U.S. military chose a site for its new airbase. The site was Kindley Field, and Kindley Field was directly adjacent to the Aster estate at Ferry Reach. The silence was deafening. Construction began in the early 1940s. The military operation transformed the eastern end of Bermuda. Runways were built. Barracks were erected. The quiet, isolated character of Ferry Reach, the very quality that had drawn Vincent Astor to the location, was destroyed overnight. The estate that had been a retreat from the world was now next door to a military airfield. The privacy was gone. The silence was gone. The paradise was over. Vincent didn't fight it. He didn't protest. He didn't try to have the base moved. He was a patriot. He had served in the Navy in the First World War. He had spent years conducting informal intelligence operations for Roosevelt aboard his yacht, monitoring ship traffic in the Caribbean and reporting to the White House. When the military needed the land next to his estate, he stepped aside. He left Ferry Reach. The estate was sold. The mansion was emptied. The railway stopped running. And the 22 acres that had been, for a brief, shimmering decade, the most exclusive private retreat in the Atlantic, went quiet. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The Rothschilds' estates seized during the World Wars. The Vanderbilts' mansions demolished under tax pressure. The Astors' Bermuda paradise abandoned when the military moved in next door. The greatest fortunes of the Gilded Age built private worlds, and the wars and taxes and institutional machinery of the 20th century took them apart, one by one, estate by estate, island by island. Now let's talk about what's still there, because the ruins are still there. And the ruins are the part nobody mentions. The mansion still stands. It sits on its hill above Castle Harbor, its windows looking out over the same blue water that Vincent saw when he chose the site. The estate has been divided among private owners, none of them Astors. The gardens are overgrown, the boathouse is a ruin, the swimming pool is a shell, and the railway. The engine shed, where the miniature B&O locomotive was housed, still stands near the old junction point. Inside it, as recently as the early 2000s, visitors reported seeing the remnants of the track and the turntable. Astor's Halt, the private junction where the Aster line met the Bermuda Railway, is now a point on the Bermuda Railway Trail, a walking and cycling path that follows the old mainline route. Hikers pass the ruins without knowing what they are. A derelict building, a patch of overgrown track, the remains of a world that existed for less than a decade and then vanished so completely that even Bermuda's own heritage literature barely mentions it. The deeper I went, the more I found that the Aster estate at Ferry Reach has fallen into a gap in the historical record. It's too small to feature in the grand narrative of the Aster dynasty. It's too American to feature prominently in Bermuda's British colonial history. It's too brief, barely a decade of active use, to accumulate the kind of institutional memory that longer-lived estates carry. And so it sits, on its hill, with its view, mentioned in a few blog posts, photographed by a few railway enthusiasts, walked past by hundreds of hikers who don't know that the derelict building at the edge of the trail once housed a miniature locomotive built as a replica of one of the most famous engines in American railroading. I want to pause here and ask something that isn't usually asked. What does it mean to build a paradise and then leave it? Because Vincent Astor didn't lose Ferry Reach the way the Rothschilds lost their Viennese palaces. It wasn't seized, it wasn't bombed, it wasn't confiscated by an occupying army. He left. The military base made the location untenable, and he walked away. He had other homes, other yachts, other lives to lead. The estate was a winter retreat, not a dynasty seat. He could afford to let it go. But the letting go is what haunts, because the estate was built by a man who had inherited everything and then spent his life trying to find a place where the everything didn't follow him. Ferry Reach was the end of the line, the last stop on the railway, the farthest point from Manhattan that a train could carry you on a British island in the middle of the Atlantic. And even there, at the end of the line, the world caught up. The war arrived, the military built next door. The silence that had made the place sacred was replaced by the sound of aircraft engines. Vincent Astor spent the rest of his life giving money away. He and his third wife, Brooke, created the Vincent Astor Foundation, which donated over $195 million to New York institutions before it was dissolved in 1997. When Vincent died in 1959, the fortune that had begun with a fur trader in the 1780s and survived the Titanic in 1912 was finally, deliberately, systematically returned to the city it had been extracted from. And the estate in Bermuda, the private paradise with the miniature railway and the view of Castle Harbor, was already forgotten. I don't have a complete theory. I have a question that multiplies the deeper I look. Why does the most exclusive private retreat, built by one of the richest families in American history, sit in ruins on a Bermuda hillside with almost no public documentation? Why does the Bermuda Railway Trail pass within yards of the Aster engine shed without a historical marker? Why is a private, narrow-gauge railway, built by the chairman of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, connected to a public rail network at a station bearing the family name, treated as a footnote in both Aster history and Bermuda history? Why does a 22-acre estate, built by the son of the richest man to die on the Titanic, not appear in any major documentary or heritage program. And the question underneath all the others, the one that sits on the hill above Castle Harbor, in the mansion that nobody lives in, looking out over water that hasn't changed since the day Vincent Astor first saw it and decided this was far enough. Why does nobody talk about it? I'll leave you with this. If you ever walk the Bermuda Railway Trail along the eastern section, past the old oil docks, past Ferry Road, toward Ferry Point Park, look to your left. There is a building in the undergrowth. It is a ruin. It is the engine shed of a private railway that once carried guests from a private jetty to a private mansion built by a man whose father drowned on the most famous ship in history. The track is gone. The locomotive is gone. The guests are gone. The man who built it is gone. But the shed is still there, and the mansion is still on the hill. And the view that drew Vincent Astor to the end of the line, is still the finest on the island. Nobody marked it. Nobody preserved it. Nobody talks about it. Walk past it slowly and ask yourself what else is sitting at the end of a trail, in plain sight, that nobody thought to remember.